2nd of November. I guess it's fortuitous or coincidental or I don't know, fate that we are having this discussion, and I really didn't do this on purpose, but it is fortuitous, I suppose, that we are having this on the 106th anniversary, I think 106 years, of the Balfour Declaration, which really kick-started this entire thing off. And I will be talking about the Balfour Declaration, but it happened on 2nd November 1917. Okay, so good evening, good night, everyone. So I will be discussing the Palestinian conflict issue tonight, and feel free to type in your questions, and again, pardon me for the incoherence that's gonna come up because this is sort of impromptu. I did this, honestly, it was at Khalid's insistence. I was wondering whether I should do an episode because I already went on Plan B, and that is a podcast with far more reach than mine. So please check out that episode where I did discuss the Palestinian issue and my thoughts on it. But I thought, okay, just have it here as well. So I really wanted to talk about 4 or 5 things. Feel free to type in your comments or questions, and I'll see. I mean, I wanted to just keep it short today. I want to keep it short. We'll see how it goes. So I wanted to talk about 4 or 5 things. So the first is I wanted to just give a little bit of a historical background to this conflict. Second, I will talk about the current situation. Third, I wanted to talk about the dehumanization, the consistent dehumanization of Palestinians, which of course is unacceptable. Fourth, I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism, which has been on the rise, and it is something that is a scourge, and I wanted to unpack that a little. And finally, we'll talk about Singapore as well, okay, and what it means for Singapore in terms of foreign policy and domestic politics and so on. Okay, so first of all, we'll go with history. So the first theme is history, and one of the things that you always hear from people, right? Oh, this issue is complex, right? This issue is complex. Okay, maybe some parts are complex, some parts are not that complex. So when people say that, I think it's incumbent on us to ask them, what do you mean? Which parts are complex? What do you mean? And if it's complex, or is it complex beyond comprehension, or is it that you are using it as a reason, as an excuse for you not to say anything meaningful about the issue, right? So Dr. Norman Finkelstein, he said that one of the things that he found was that this issue, he was surprised at how not complex this issue is, right? Elon Pep, he also said something similar, and there are some things which are complex about this conflict, but some things are not. And this conflict didn't start on 7th October, as horrendous as the events of that day were. This conflict didn't even start on 6th October or 1st October 2023, right? This conflict started way back. It didn't even start with the founding of Israel, the State of Israel in 1948. One could very well point towards 1917 as the point in which this thing started, and that is the Balfour Declaration, right? The Balfour Declaration, which was signed, or it was declared on the 2nd of November 1917, where the British government, well, at that time, the time of the empire, and talking about Palestine, which was gonna go to the British because the Ottoman Empire was in decline. It was 7 years before the dissolution, a few years before the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and the British was gonna govern Palestine, and there was a mandate of Palestine. But in 1917, the Balfour Declaration was essentially the British government promising to the Zionist Jews, the land that was Palestine, the British promising the Zionists the land that was Palestine. So in the words, and the Palestinians were not at the table. The Palestinians were not consulted. Palestinian statehood was not on the table. So Palestinians were in the land, were in Palestine. There were Palestinians. There was Palestine, and unfortunately, they were not part of this Balfour Declaration. And in the words of George Galloway, right, the Balfour Declaration is essentially this. It was one man on behalf of one people. So one man, and that's Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, one man on behalf of one people, on behalf of the British, promising to another man, Lord Rothschild, on behalf of another people, the Zionist Jews, the land which belonged to a third people, the land which belonged to the Palestinians. And you notice there was no Palestinian representative there. Professor Rashid Khalidi calls the Balfour Declaration the first declaration of war on the Palestinian people. So it was at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and when there was talk about Arab statehood, so all the different nations, there were talk of them being granted the right to self-determination, which is a right under the UN. Right to self-determination means each population can decide the statehood. Right? They are entitled to statehood. So every Arab population was granted that, or almost every Arab population was promised that, except the Palestinians. Now, why was the Balfour Declaration signed? Why did that happen? Well, a few reasons. One is, the most important reason, of course, is strategic, right? It's about protecting British interest and protecting the empire. And of course, Egypt and India were the two of the most important parts of the British Empire, and therefore Britain wanted to protect its interest in Egypt. Of course, Palestine borders Egypt. Another reason that has been given by historians is that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe at that time, even way before the Holocaust. There is a history of anti-Semitism in Europe, and the British, like many other European countries, were happy to have a state for the Jews and send their own Jews there, right? They wanted to get rid of their Jews, and they were happy to have them move to another place. And that was what happened. Of course, that's not the main reason, but that is a motivating factor for a lot of what happened back then in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. But essentially, it was about protecting the interest of the empire. So from the outset, the Palestinians were excluded from that, right? And you see that where this was going, right? Once the state of Israel was formed and the Palestinians were not recognized, even though when they live in that own land, there was always going to be a problem, right? I will return to this slogan later, right? So one of the slogans that the Zionists used when they were campaigning for Palestine to be their land, they said, "A land without people for a people without land." So a land without people. So Palestine, a land which didn't have people, for a people without land. So for the Jews, who didn't have a homeland of their own at that point in time. And you can understand the second sentiment, because the Jews were really oppressed and repressed throughout a lot of their history, most of their history, and that's factual, right? But the first part, a land without people. So what were the Palestinians if they were not people, right? So there was already that dehumanization that was taking place from the get-go. Now, so I will skip over some important dates, but the most important years: 1917, Balfour Declaration; 1948, the founding of the State of Israel; 1967, the Six-Day War and the start of occupation. So those would be the three main ones. And of course, you had the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, which I may get to later on. 1948, the State of Israel was formed, and Nakba, the dispossession of the Palestinians. Then 1967, where a few Arab countries got together loosely, because it was eventually Arab disunity that undid them. But they got together, they attacked Israel, they fought a war with Israel, and Israel won, defeated them comprehensively, and expanded the territorial occupation, or started the territorial occupation. And UN Resolution 242 is about 1967, about how Israel needs to end its occupation that intensified or started with the 1967 war, the aftermath of the 1967 war. So if you look at the map of Israel and Palestine, right? So Palestine, there are two parts to it. One is the West Bank, so Jerusalem, and that borders Jordan, and the other is Gaza, which borders Egypt, right? So in between, it's all Israel. So, and you have those two parts are occupied now, and this is important. So West Bank and Gaza, they are separated by huge chunks of land in between, which of course is Israeli land, but both areas are occupied, right? And that's important because I'll get to that later on. So that's 1967. So you can say that the Palestinian story is a story of dispossession since 1948 and occupation since 1967, right? So when I say occupation, I do mean occupation. Anyone who has been there, who has been to Palestine, would know that there are military checkpoints, that there is little freedom of movement in Palestine for the Palestinians, right? So it's literally an occupation, right? So at various times, like in Gaza, there was even blockade, right? So it's more than just occupation, but at the baseline there is occupation. So that was 1967. Now, the Oslo Accords, which happened in the 1990s, that was supposed to be the path to peace, where there was a moderation on the part of Ishaq Rabin, the Israeli leader, and Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader. And there was supposed to be some compromise between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And even though, of course, it wasn't like a lot of these agreements, right, there's still some ambiguity, right, to allow for some flexibility. So, but by and large, it was celebrated. That was celebrated not by, interestingly, it wasn't celebrated by many Palestinians. So some did, but many Palestinians didn't. In fact, Professor Edward Said called it the Palestinian Versailles, right? There were many people who rejected it and saying Arafat didn't have the mandate to actually do whatever he did and compromise and give up a lot of the land that in that eventual solution, peace solution. But essentially, the Oslo Accords did take place, right? And that was supposed to be the blueprint for peace. And people talk about the two-state solution, which is something Singapore supports as well, the international community supports. Other people have talked about the one-state solution, instead of having a two-state solution where Arab state, Palestinian state, Jewish state, just have one democratic state where every citizen is equal, right? And I think that is appealing in theory. I don't see how the Israelis would accept that. I mean, I just don't see the pathway to that. So if that is possible, then I say, okay, fine. But a two-state or one-state solution for me, it doesn't matter what matters the most. What is the pathway to peace, right? Because it has been, war and occupation has been going on for way too long, right? But we'll get to that later on. So those are the historical dates, right? So 1917, Balfour Declaration; 1948, founding of Israel and Nakba, the dispossession of the Palestinians; 1967, the Arab Wars, which eventually resulted in Israeli occupation of West Bank and Gaza after the defeat of the Arab countries and the Arab armies. So hopefully that is really, and the Oslo Accords in the early 90s, and that is really a very, very brief history of this particular conflict. Those are the main dates, I would say, right? But if there is only one, then I would say it's 1917, and that really set the tone for whatever was going to happen later on. Now that's the history, right? What now? And I see that a lot of the way that this is being framed now is Israel and Hamas is the Israeli-Hamas war, right? And to some extent, of course, that's true. And what Hamas did on 7 October was, of course, unacceptable. And I think any fair-minded, any decent person would find that unacceptable, right? The killing of innocent people is always unacceptable. So, so there's that. Two things I wanted to add to that. First of all, Hamas is in charge of Gaza, and that has been the case since 2006. Even though elections haven't taken place since then, they were elected, but elections haven't been taking place since then. So they've been suspended. But Hamas is not in the West Bank, but the West Bank is still occupied. Right. So, for people who want to say, oh, what about, oh, this is about Hamas, this is about Hamas. Yes, I mean, Hamas is an important part of it since 7 October especially. But there's West Bank. Hamas is not there, but occupation is still there. Hamas was formed in the 1980s, right? But the occupation started way before that, right? So Hamas is an important part of the picture. We cannot ignore that, but it's not the most important part of the picture, right? Because there are other moving parts of this as well. So that's currently what is happening. And as you know, in Gaza, there's this blockade, there's attacks on civilian population. Of course, the Israeli government has said that it's not targeted, but the question I would ask is, if, let's say, Hamas was hiding in other populations in Tel Aviv, would the Israeli government attack in the way that they do? And if the answer is no, then we have to ask the question, is it because Palestinian civilian lives are considered collateral damage, whereas other civilian lives are not considered collateral damage? So I think anyone who has been watching and following this conflict closely, it's very, very hard not to have your heartstrings being tugged, right? It's very hard to not feel angry, upset, and emotional about this, as we all should. When we see, and if we are not emotional about children dying and children being killed, well, I don't know what we should be emotional about, right? But not just children, right? Men, women, people, just innocent people are dying, right? So the current situation is that now we have a government in Israel which is increasingly becoming more right-wing under Netanyahu and the coalition government, and we know that a lot of people do not benefit from war. Most people do not benefit from war, but some people do, whether it's politically and whether the Israeli right-wing government, whether it's Hamas. Some people do benefit from war, and that's the unfortunate reality of trying to attain peace. So currently, that's where we are at. The US has been supporting Israel, and that is the most crucial part. If the US doesn't support Israel, then it will not be able to get away with a lot of the things that it gets away with. So even if there's international condemnation, as long as the support from the US is really strong, then it's unlikely that whatever is happening will change. Now, however, this time round, I am a bit optimistic. Because what I have seen today is something I have never seen before, which is I've seen far more outpourings of support from people, especially those who are not Muslim. So Muslims have always been interested in this issue, right? So this issue has always been an important issue for Muslims, because I mean, the Masjid Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's a holy site in Islam, and the Palestinian cause has always been close to the hearts of Muslims. So Muslims have always been interested in this, but for the first time I see that there's more and more, it's increasing, right? Support for the Palestinian cause from non-Muslims, right? And you know, the reality is, even though many of us in Singapore are passionate about this issue. The reality is public opinion in Singapore is not going to change much. Not that it's not going to change anything, but it's not going to change much. What matters the most is public opinion in the West, especially public opinion in America. That is what is going to change, right? Because if that changes, then the American government stand will change, and then that will exert some pressure on Israel, right? So in the rest of the world, yes, it matters, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as what happens in America. So that's why I am a little optimistic, cautiously optimistic, and just slightly, because this is not going to be the last time this happens, unfortunately, right? There will be escalation of violence because occupation is still there. Occupation is still there. So there will be, in a sense, the conflict is ongoing, right? So there will be escalation and episodic bouts of violence, right? That will happen from time to time. And occupation is there, and blockade is there, and there are all forms of issues about human rights abuses and so on. So this issue is not going to go away, right? So this is really the long game, right? The long game. So that is where we are at currently. I hope I sufficiently talked about what is the current situation. And if you guys have any questions, if it's unclear, I know I'm a little bit all over the place, but if you have any questions, feel free to type them in, right? Now, so the third thing I wanted to talk about is a theme that I have seen consistently, right? And this is the dehumanization of Palestinians, right? Now, you can say that broadly speaking, it's related to, Orientalism and how Arabs, or specifically Muslims, are otherized by the world, especially by the West. But in this particular case, you can see that Palestinians in particular are dehumanized. I already talked about a land without people for a people without land. And that started very, very early on, even before the Balfour Declaration. That was the slogan of many Zionists. And you hear people saying, "Oh, we should raise Gaza to the ground, or we should send them back to the Middle Ages." This is something Israeli politicians have said over the years. Even lately, there are no civilians in Gaza, and you have to think, wow. If you can dehumanize an entire population, when you say there's no civilians in Gaza amongst 2 point something million, basically you're saying they're fair game, right? They are either Hamas terrorists or Hamas sympathizers, right? And therefore they're fair game, right? And there is no, for you, there is no nothing holding you back from destroying them, decimating them. And that dehumanization is extremely dangerous, right? That dehumanization can take many forms, and one of the ways that it has manifested is people equating Hamas to Palestinians, right? And Hamas is it, of course, it did come out of Palestine. There are specific socio-historical circumstances that resulted in the creation of Hamas. But Hamas is not Palestine, right? Palestinians have existed way before Hamas. They will continue to exist way after Hamas. There is no Hamas in the West Bank. There is still occupation. And most Palestinians are not part of Hamas. And since 2006, there have not been elections, so they didn't get to vote for Hamas or not since then. So to equate Hamas and Palestinians, I think, is a mistake. And I think for people who are more pro-Palestine, like myself, and especially my friends who are Muslims, I think when we are being pro-Palestine, we need to understand there is no need for us to defend the indefensible. So our support for Palestine must always be based on principles. It cannot be based on ad hoc or post hoc justification, right? So our support must always be based on principles, and I think that history is on our side. But we will lose credibility when we start trying to defend the indefensible, when we start trying to rationalize attacks on innocent civilians, right? We would lose all forms of moral credibility. And then it becomes about might is right. And if it's might is right, we cannot win, right? Because Israel will defeat the Palestinians. I think what we have in this, right, is moral credibility if we are able to, based on principle, criticize whoever needs to be criticized. So I have no problems criticizing Hamas for whatever they did, because Hamas is not my role model, right? So for me, like, it should be based on principles, and the loss of innocent lives, right, whatever color, wherever they are from, I think that is something we must be said, and we must be said about, and we must condemn, right? Now, at the same time, I wanted to also say, right, there is a tendency in Western media, whenever it's a pro-Palestinian activist or it's a Muslim, right, the first thing they'll ask is, do you condemn Hamas, right? Do you condemn Hamas? And Bassem Youssef, he just did another interview with Piers Morgan, but his first one, that was a master class in how somebody should respond. And I think the way he conducted the interview, it really shows the power of comedy. And he said that if you want me to condemn Hamas, Hummus, Hassan, I'll condemn all of them, right? And the issue is, we have to ask, as I said, we have no problems, and when somebody asks us, the first thing we should do is we just condemn, right? But then we should ask them, why do you ask me that, right? Why would you think that I would be okay with innocent people being killed? That's the first thing, right? And that's very insulting to me, right? That's very insulting when you are asking me, and it's almost as if you are assuming that I'll be okay with this unless proven otherwise. And secondly, is this question only asked of Muslims? And if that is the case, then I would say it's a very prejudicial question, right? That's a very prejudicial question. So we must, yes, I'm happy to condemn, but then I'm going to ask you, do you condemn the killing of innocent people? And if you're not going to answer, I'm going to stay there. I'm going to stay there until you condemn it. And then I'm also going to ask, why do you only ask me? Why do you only ask Muslims this question, right? And is it because a Muslim is guilty until proven innocent, right? And that's something unacceptable, and that's something we have to reject, right? That's something we have to completely reject. Now, Faisal said, why nobody talks about Hamas started and funded by Israel? Well, the issue is more complex than that. I mean, even Netanyahu did talk about one of the ways that that they want to maintain power, right, is to support Hamas, right, to ensure that Hamas is still in operation, to give them justification, right? I mean, he did talk about this. So it's not as if, oh, like Hamas was completely, like they were all Israeli agents. It's not like that. But there's real politics involved, of course. There are interests in keeping war going, as I mentioned earlier. Even though most people do not benefit from war, some people do. So the dehumanization of Palestinians, right, it takes place in many ways, right? So you hear, oh, I fully condemn this. I fully condemn the killing of Israelis, right? Palestinians, how many people died, right? How many people died? Where did they die? I'm sad about it, but do I really condemn? I think that is another form of dehumanization, right? And I think, just as I said, a fair-minded person, a fair-minded pro-Palestinian person should have no hesitation criticizing Hamas atrocities, right? I think somebody who is not, then please consider that. You have to consider why, when the shoe is on the other foot, it suddenly becomes okay to not condemn, right? And that's something we need to. So there's a question here about supporting Palestine is considered as is incitement. Well, I don't think actually it is. That is the position of the government actually, but I'll get to that later on. I would say that's a slight mischaracterization, but I'll get to that and then see whether you accept my explanation later on. Okay, so that's for the dehumanization of Palestinians. And I think when you dehumanize a person, you dehumanize a politician, then there will be it becomes much easier to justify violence against it. Now, then this is an interesting point, right? The asking for condemnation maybe because there have been so many rallies where people celebrate the Hamas killings. Well, first of all, I'm not sure about the so many rallies. But second of all, interestingly, I urge you, Wims Mowe, to watch Basim Yusuf's second interview with Piers Morgan. And he gave a few examples where you saw right-wing extremists in Israel celebrating the deaths and the killings of Palestinians, including children, over the years. Not just not today, but over the years, right? If that is the case, right? If because there is that celebration, therefore all Muslims have to disavow. I've never seen Piers Morgan or anybody else ask that of pro-Israeli people, right? So there is still that double standards, even though you are right. If there are rallies where people celebrate the Hamas killings, then yes, I think that is highly problematic. I've already said that. I think that people who support Palestine do not need to do that, and they need to dissociate themselves from that. Actually, right? I'm just saying that there shouldn't be double standards. No, so that's about the dehumanization of Palestinians. Now, the fourth point I wanted to talk about is anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism has been around for the longest time. And, of course, it culminated in the Holocaust. But that's the most extreme. I mean, that's the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. But that's the most extreme form of anti-Semitism. There are many other forms, far more insidious, or far more quotidian, right? Everyday forms of anti-Semitism, right? So two things I wanted to say on this, right? One is when people who are criticizing Israel, you must ensure that you do not veer into the anti-Semitic criticisms, because that is completely unfair. That's just how, like, a Muslim wouldn't want somebody to use a broad brush, right, to paint every single Muslim, right, based on the actions of one or a few people. So it's completely unfair for a person to do that. Secondly, just as a Muslim, most of the prophets that Muslims believe in, most of them are Jews. So it doesn't even make sense to be. I mean, I'm talking about from the Muslim perspective, to be anti-Semitic, right? So it doesn't make a lot of intellectual sense. And finally, I think just practically also, so just on the moral level, I think it's wrong, but also practically it takes away the moral credibility when you are talking about being pro-Palestine, right? So I think it doesn't make sense. Now, at the same time, what I would say is this: a lot of times people use anti-Semitism as an excuse. When people criticize Israel, that's not criticizing Jews or the Jewish population, right? Because Israel is a political entity. It's not a racial or religious entity per se, right? Of course, there are racial and religious elements, but it is a political entity. So I refuse to accept that, right? When people say, oh, okay, when you criticize Israel, oh, this is anti-Semitism. No, that's like saying, oh, if I criticize the Saudi government, that's being Islamophobic. That's a preposterous claim, right? So Saudi government is fair game. You can criticize it, right? Because that's and there are plenty. There's plenty to talk about when it comes to government. So I think when we hear anti-Semitism, and yes, anti-Semitism, we must reject it, and it's a scourge. At the same time, we must not, as in, it cannot just be used, right? It cannot just be used to, oh, any criticism of Israel is dismissed because of that, right? So there is a question. UN and Human Rights International has condemned Israel for human rights violations. So why hasn't UN and other countries calling for imposed sanctions, like how the world sanctioned Russia? Yeah, because Israel is supported by US, and that, as I said earlier, if US public opinion turns, then you'll see something different here, right? So that's what I would say for anti-Semitism. Okay, so finally, right? So we bring this back to Singapore, right? So what happens, right, for Singapore? So firstly, I just wanted to say, right, that there are many people, right? Many people I've seen who they will comment on every single issue, every single social justice issue under the sun. And if there's an auntie that falls at the lift landing in Tampines, they'll comment about that also, and then they'll write long posts about it. Right? But when it comes to this, suddenly the cat got their tongue, and they had nothing to do. They had nothing to say, or they say some very vague, some very asinine or meaningless things because they don't want to take a stand. I don't know why, because maybe they don't want to offend the powers that be wherever they are, or whatever it is. They're afraid of getting cancer, whatever it is. I don't know, right? So I have no problems with people not saying anything, right? If they always do not say anything about important social issues, because it's not easy to comment on this. It's really not, right? But I do have a problem with people who comment on every single thing, but when it comes to this, they suddenly cannot say, and then they write long posts about why they don't have anything to say. I don't know. They write long posts about saying, "Oh, I don't really have anything to say," and that, so I also don't know what to make of it, right? But anyway, so going back to Singapore, right? So what is the before I get to Singapore, there's a comment. Palestinians are Semitic people too. Yes. So the term Semitic does refer to Arabs as well, right? So people who are there. But the usage of the term anti-Semitism today it refers to anti-Jewish sentiments, right? I feel like that's sort of a red herring. So we don't want to call that anti-Semitism, fine, we can call it whatever, anti-Jewish sentiments or whatever it is. It still means the concept is still the same, right? So I find that I've seen a lot of that response online, but I find that it's not a particularly convincing or persuasive argument, right? All right, so I'll get to the Singapore stand, and then I'll try to read as many questions as possible. If I miss the questions, please feel free to retype them. Okay. So if you look at the Singapore stand, Singapore has always maintained a pretty consistent stand on this, right? Supporting the two-state solution. And of course, Singapore has ties with Israel, but Singapore is supportive of Palestinian statehood as well. And the genesis of Singapore's relations with Israel, even though from the start Lee Kuan Yew did know and recognize that the relationship with Israel is a potential thorny one with regard to the relationship with Malaysia and Indonesia, especially Malaysia, but also the Muslim community in Singapore because of the Palestinian issue. So Lee Kuan Yew actually initially approached Egypt and India for support for Singapore's military, and both of them turned Singapore down because they probably didn't want to offend Malaysia. So Singapore approached Israel, and Israel helped, and initially I think they were disguised as Mexicans. So I mean, Lee Kuan Yew and the government said, oh, they were Mexicans, but eventually, I mean, it became an open secret, right? This special relationship between Singapore and Israel, and I think that's a historical fact, and we cannot deny that. I think that's real politics as well. We cannot just ignore that. We cannot ignore the relationship, the military, economic relationship between these two countries. At the same time, Singapore's foreign policy has always been a friend to all and enemy to none, right? So ultimately, that is Singapore's foreign policy, and PM Lee actually said that it makes sense for Singapore to have good relations with Israel and Palestine. And I think, given the foreign policy thrusts, I think that's a perfectly reasonable stand from the government, right? I don't, and in fact, the friendship is always based on interests and principles, right? So it's not an unconditional kind of trust or unconditional kind of love, because there is no such thing, especially in international relations. So Singapore did vote against Israel, right, in the United Nations vote recently. So, and that's significant, and that really encapsulates Singapore's stand on this particular issue and on most foreign policy issues as well. So always trying to to be as neutral as possible, except when it comes to certain really core principles, right? While maintaining friendships with as many entities as possible. Now, this time round also, I would say that I have seen more overtly, I don't want to say pro-Palestinian rhetoric, but you can see that it's more Palestinian-friendly rhetoric, even though the policies and the stances have remained the same, right? So I think Minister Shanmugam early on, he said that we will see it's okay to find what the conditions that the Palestinians have gone through deplorable, and he mentioned the word deplorable, while at the same time condemning Hamas, which I'm completely on board with that, with both parts of that statement. And then PM Lee mentioned that this issue is close to the hearts of Muslims, and I thought that was a nice acknowledgement. And also we mustn't pretend that that isn't the case, right? I mean, Muslims are the ones who feel the most about this issue. Of course, there are other people who do, and I think that should be the case. But I think it's natural that Muslims would feel the most about this. And then President Taman, of course, I think went even further with his statement, and I think the sum total of these statements shows an acknowledgement on the part of the government. And you see a lot of donation drives by the government in support of the Gazan residents. So I think sum total, this is something that we should celebrate, and that's the government recognizing that this issue matters especially to the Muslims, but to many others as well, and this is something that we cannot just dismiss. Now, of course, there will be many people who are not as pro-Palestine as myself or others, right? And that's just the reality of life, right? And one of the things that we must understand, and especially, maybe some conservative Christians have a different view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, of course, this issue is extremely close to my heart, and it is something I would fundamentally disagree with them. But ultimately, it wouldn't, or it shouldn't affect our relationship in Singapore, right? So, this the idea is, if you import conflicts here, external conflicts, first of all, you do not solve those external conflicts. Second of all, you are creating more conflicts here, right? So it just doesn't make sense, right? So, to answer the earlier question, I think supporting Palestine is considered incitement, and I would say I don't think that would be a fair criticism of the government. I think I have been openly pro-Palestinian statehood, and I think I don't think we should make apologies for that. I don't think this would be considered incitement, right? So what would be considered incitement would be incitement. Now, maybe, I don't know, who was the one that asked that question? Maybe you are referring to the rally, right? Maybe you are referring to the rally that was disallowed. And the government actually did mention why it was disallowed. Now, I think, I don't know whether Sarah is here. If you are, please say hi, Sarah. And so the organizers did ask me for some advice, and I did help them with crafting the statement, the petition. So of course I am disappointed that the rally didn't take place, but just from the government's perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? Because if there is any whiff of potential racial and religious disharmony or dissent, then the Singapore government has always taken that seriously, right? I mean, that's not my stand, but that has always been their stand. And if the government doesn't allow a pro-Palestinian and a pro-Israeli rally, I don't think you can say that that's being unfair, right? If they didn't allow the pro-Palestinian rally, but they allowed the pro-Israeli rally, then that's a problem, right? But that wasn't the case, and Minister Shanmugam said, because there were calls for the pro-Israeli rally as well, so they just didn't. They took the safer approach of not allowing, right? Now, you may disagree with that, and I think I'm always for more, openness and so on, but I don't think that's being unfair, right? So even though I disagree with the decision, I don't think what I would say is, that's the government being unfair. I would say the government is being too conservative, and that's fine. They have always been, and I think they have always said that when it comes to race and religion, they don't take chances, right? And because this particular issue, even though it is political at its heart, we cannot deny that there may be some religious or religious element to this, right? Because Muslims may be supporting one side, Christians may be supporting another side. So the worry on their part is that is ultimately Singapore's racial and religious harmony. And every government, and the Singapore government, their primary responsibility, and some would say their sole responsibility, is to Singaporeans. It's not to other people, right? And that's what they are thinking about, right? They are thinking about societal order and harmony. So yes, I am disappointed with that decision, but I can totally see where they are coming from, especially since they were even-handed and didn't allow any demonstration at all. So I hope I cleared that up. So I'm just trying to see whether I missed some questions. Could you comment on the BDS movement and what it may take for it to work? Well, like most boycott movements, what it will take is a critical mass, right, for it to work. So what I would say is this, right? For people who are engaging in BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, so boycotting brands which support Israel and so on. So you must, for those who want to do it, it mustn't be at the expense of your own well-being. That's what I would say, right? So what would it take for work? I mean, critical mass, right? So and I think for me, as I said earlier, the crucial factor here, what would change things, is public sentiment in the US. So I see if BDS, right, it should be part of that, of changing that public opinion, rather than just crippling Israel's economy per se, right? Because I think it is really about the former rather than the latter in causing change. Right? So why should we not have a Palestine embassy? Well, we do have a representative to Palestine from Singapore. So the Singapore government does have formal relations with Palestine, right? Mr. Hawazi Daipi, the former PAP MP, he's the non-resident representative of Singapore to Palestine. So yes, that is our stand, right? So Arun asks, you've mentioned that you've seen a shift in public sentiments towards the Palestinians. What do you think explains this? Yes, I do think it is largely social media that has caused this, and I think it's very difficult. I think most people generally are not evil, right? I won't go as far as saying most human beings are good, but there's goodness in most human beings. But most people are not evil, and I think it's very difficult for a human being, not to be emotionally affected when you see whatever you see online, right? Whatever that has come out, especially, you know, with Palestinians themselves putting up pictures and saying this. I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult to not feel anything, right? So there is a question. I shall not mention the questioner because of the nature of the question. So I understand what Hamas did on 7 October was horrible, but how do we reconcile that with the idea that this was Hamas's way of resisting the oppressor after being subjected to abuse for decades? The moment you start, which is true, that's exactly what they would say, right? It is true that that's what they would say. But the moment you abandon principles and say that this is justified because of this, then there's no end to that already, right? Anything can be justified based on a prior bad act, right? So I feel like even in resistance, right, there must be ethics and principles involved in resistance, right? Of course, I acknowledge I am saying this from the comfort of my own home, and I'm not there. So, of course, take this with many pinches of salt. But I feel that the moment we open that door, that, okay, because this happened to you, and therefore everything is fair game, I mean, where do we draw the line? Then what's the use of international law? Why do we need to have international law? We do this and so on. And yeah, so I think Nick said, so when you are fighting monsters, must one become a monster? And the moment you do that, I feel like you lose all forms of moral authority or superiority on that. And then what are you opposing on? if you no longer have moral authority or credibility. So that would be my response to that. And I feel that the moment you open that door, the door can never be closed already. Right? I mean, the reason why we are critical of Israel now is because they are abandoning international law in order to take out one or a few Hamas leaders, and then a few hundred people or a few thousand people are dying. And we say this is unacceptable. What if they also use that justification, a prior bad act, right? And then there's no end to it. Yeah, so which is why I think that we cannot do that. Now, it's not just Zizek who said this. So Nick said, Zizek said that oppression corrupts both the oppressor and the oppressed. And it's Fanon who said, right, in resisting colonialism, right, even the resistor, right, gets transformed, right, spiritually. So yeah, and that is unfortunately the case, right? So yes, so that is what that is how I would end my final point. If there are no more questions, my final point was really on that, on understanding how Singapore fits into all of this. And I would say the statements and the movements, the moves by the government so far, I think have been pretty alright. I think trying to maintain neutrality as much as possible while giving a nod to the Palestinians and Muslim sentiments. So I would say generally I have no problems with that. So Arun said, international laws and norms gain or lose credibility depending on conformity to them, as well as consequences for violating them. Right. So unfortunately, Hamas actions were a gift to the Israeli Far Right. Absolutely. So I think what Hamas did, so in principle I oppose it, but also just practically, right, I think it had which I think it has changed now, but for a moment it looked like it could have changed public sentiment, which was in the West slowly moving towards Palestine more, right? And I thought Hamas's actions reversed that, but then Israel's counter actions have counter reversed that. What do you think of the spread of misinformation at this point in time? Well, misinformation has always spread, right? I think what is different now, like social media allows a counter narrative on the part of, so it's not just social media. So one is social media, it allows for a counter narrative. But secondly, today we see more pro-Palestinian public figures, which 10 years ago we would not have seen, right? So whether it's pop culture and so on, you know, who's that celebrity, like something Hadid, who's pro-Palestinian. So that person, and then you have Mo Salah, of course, who publicly said that, who publicly supported the Palestinian cause, and that's, for me, that's huge. And then you have the various people that Piers Morgan brings on, and these are people who are articulate, they can push back, and they can really give a different side that Western audiences are not exposed to. So for all of my criticisms towards Piers Morgan, and believe me, I have a lot, I think he is one of the least culpable perpetrators in this particular episode. In the mainstream media, a lot of them would never give such coverage to the pro-Palestinian voices, right? So I think we have, is it? Oh, Gigi and Bella Hadid. Okay, thank you. So I don't really know too much about them, but all I know is they publicly supported the Palestinian cause. So that's good, and I think we see more and more of this today compared to previously. So it's not just social media, it's also the presence of this more articulate pro-Palestinian voices who have platforms that we've never seen in the past. Yes, I can mention Basim Yusuf, definitely. So, what are your views on Singaporeans criticizing MFA's stand and statements it makes in regard to the conflict? Are they against our national interests if they criticize the balancing act we play? Well, I think, first of all, anything should be up for debate and discussion. So, if a normal Singaporean is criticizing a particular thing. I don't think, oh, that's a traitor or that's going against national interest and so on, right? But what I would say is, what I would call for is a deeper understanding of real politics, which is what I tried to do. And I mean, I understand that the genesis of Singapore's relationship with Israel, that's not something that we can just ignore, and also the closeness of that relationship. And I think Singaporeans need to appreciate that. At the same time, the government acknowledges that the Palestinians also deserve statehood, and therefore they try to do that balancing act. And that balancing act is always, is not just in this issue. The government always tries to do that because our foreign policy trusts friend to all, enemy to none. And when we do offend others, is based on interest and principle. So I think understanding that those foreign policy trusts, I think is crucial. It's crucial for us because there will be other conflicts, and we must always go back to this foreign policy thrust, right? And as long as the government is consistent, I think we should be explaining and supporting this trust to Singaporeans. What would it take to shift public sentiment in the US? I think ultimately the language that politicians understand is the votes. So if there is a strong movement, right, and I saw a few leftist pro-Palestinian activists saying that Biden will remember this: if you do not call for ceasefire, we will not vote for you. And I think people must be willing to say, they should stop saying, oh, vote for the lesser evil. No, stop saying that, right? They must use their vote as a card. You don't do this, we'll not vote for you, and they should not turn up the next time, right? So ultimately, when there is votes, and that's why. So what would it take to reach there? I would say all these public appearances, all these voices, people who have platforms talking about it, and so on. Do you think the extreme violence on Palestinian civilians captured and spread through social media will change the way people view Israel? Well, I think it will. I think it will. So the more people see it, I think the more public sentiment towards Israel will change, right? Is there still a point for UN's existence? This is a good question, and NJ had to ask this at 11:30, right? 1 hour in, right? So UN is useful in many areas, but not in all areas. And we all understand that when it comes to the big powers, or countries which are supported by the big powers, the UN is extremely toothless, right? And this is the case now. Now, it's not just Israel and US support, right? Of course, you have Russia, the P5 countries, but also others, right? If they are supported by any of the P5 countries, then it becomes much harder for UN to do anything, right? So now, having said that, the moral authority of the UN leaders, right, I think it still matters, right? Because when they say something, nobody can criticize them. Oh, they are trying to politicize this, right? They're trying to... No. So when the UN chief was saying that this is a humanitarian crisis, we have to take it seriously, right? Yes. So as Nick said, the UN is important theater, but important theater. Yes. We all need a little bit of wayang in our life, right? So it functions better as an avenue for expression than an avenue for direct conflict resolution. Yes, indeed. Alright, so if there are no further questions, I hope I went through that unscathed. Hopefully. Thank you. So feel free. I am happy to discuss this issue over lunch, to discuss this with people in person. I'm really happy. So if you are extremely pro-Israel or anti-Palestine, I am more than happy to have tea with you and discuss with you. And we share our thoughts. If we disagree, that's fine, right? As I said, ultimately, right, what happens here, what happens there, we should, as much as possible, do not bring it over here in terms of course there will be some, right? You bring the emotions here and all of that, we need to ventilate, but we do not bring the conflicts here, right? So there is I think there was a final question, sorry. Will there be a push to change the P5 countries? There has always been a push, right? I think even Mahathir's second incarnation as Prime Minister, I think in his UN speech he talked about the need to change the P5, something which he has been on about, and I think people in the global south, they have talked about this at various points in time. But as Frederick Douglass said, power doesn't give itself out willingly. It never has, and it never will. It needs to be taken away from them. So I don't know how at this point in time we could take away that, right? There is a comment here, we should be pro-humanity, right? Not that that's untrue, but that is so true that it becomes meaningless, right? Yes. No, we should be. I think all of us are pro-humanity, right? All of us are pro-humanity. That's a given. I don't think we need to say, I am pro-humanity, I am pro-justice. It's just how we interpret all of this, right? And how we interpret events depends on our prior standpoints, prior worldviews, and prior biases, right? So I think to say, we all should be pro-humanity, yeah, it's not untrue. Nobody can disagree with that. But I think that's already true. That's like saying, all of us need water to live, right? It's it's true, but it doesn't mean much. Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone, and hopefully that was a useful session. Bye bye.